Hello, future teachers! Welcome to our Fun and Learning, where we don't just help kids in their lesson, but also share teaching tips and hone the gears of our future teacher. In this video, we will share you some tips on how to make a good lesson plan. A lesson plan is a teacher's daily guide for what our students or learners need to learn and the pedagogy or the methodology of teaching the lesson and how learning will be measured. Now, lesson plans help teachers more effective in the classroom by providing a detailed outline to follow for their class period. Now, since you are in your very first stage of making one, let me share to you that lesson plan ensures that every bit of class time are spent in teaching new concepts, reinforcement, and building meaningful discussion, and not just figuring out the lesson content on the fly. Now, most effective lesson plans have important parts. Now, lesson planning, as we know, has many kind of style, but I'll just share to you the basic way of writing one. In this video, I will share to you the important parts. Then we will try to come up with several examples depending of the subject matter which you will be writing. Now remember, lesson plan has important parts which play roles in the learning experience of your future students. It is important to approach them with a clear plan in mind. Now, number one is the lesson objectives. Lesson objectives list what students will be able to do during the lesson or after completing the lesson. These are your target goals, which will let you easily tell if your lesson has effectively taught your learners the concepts, the competencies, and the skills. I know this may be a tough part for you since starting is really a pain in the ass. Starting is really a pain in the ass. Starting is really a pain. What? Now, enough of the hugot there. Now, one of the most popular goal-setting strategy is the SMART criteria, which ensures that goals are focused. Now, in the content of lesson planning, you can use SMART criteria to determine your lesson objectives. Now, S stands for specific. Now, is the objective specific? Now, in this case, you should use clear, direct language to tell the learners exactly what he or she should learn and what he or she should be able to do. Now, don't be vague in making one. Don't use unclear words or misleading words. M. Is the objective measurable? That means, first, it must be an action that you can observe. Now, this is where the common mistake of using like know or understand, which are not actions that can be objectively observed. And second, the objective must be written so that the observer could watch the learner's performance and agree if the objective has been satisfied or not. Now A. Is the objective attainable by all students? Now, your learning objective must be something your learners have a chance of completing or satisfying. They may have enough pre-existing knowledge, time, or similar resources. For example, you wouldn't create a learning objective that asks an elementary school child to construct a rocket in an hour. It's just not achievable. While checking your objective at this level, make sure your learning objective isn't too easy either. R. Is the objective relevant to your class and students? The objective should be something that learner sees the value in learning. Now, don't teach material that is not important or won't be used. And T. Is the objective time-based to align with your syllabus? Now, make sure your learning objective is something your learner will have to use in a timely fashion, like tomorrow or next week instead of next year. Now, you will use all these lesson objectives as the blueprint of your lesson to create your learning assessments, learning contents, learning activities, and learning evaluations. For each objective, it is important to start with an action that relates to what the student should be able to do after the lesson. But let's just make these things clear. Lesson objectives depends on what topic you are teaching and the level of knowledge of your students. Now, the type of objective will of course vary. Now, in writing the objective of the lesson, we often follow the Bloom's taxonomy, which is a set of the three hierarchical models which are used to classify educational learning objectives into the levels of complexity and specificity. Now, the three lists cover the learning objectives in cognitive, affective, and psychomotor or the sensory domains. Now, that's why you have to remember that your objectives should be written in the CAP format or the CAP format, but some teachers prefer CPAs. Now, here's a question. Can you use multiple cognitive learning objectives and one affective and psychomotor objective? Now, to answer this, we have to go back to our SMART criteria. Do you think that your objectives meet all the requirements and the necessary goals to teach your topic? Now, think about that before creating multiple objectives. Now, another thing that you need to consider is the school standard or the national standard that dictate what you need to teach in class. In the basic education, the topics are organized in the curriculum per learning area, so you have to read and get to know with the updated curriculum in the Department of Education. Now, this thing also goes with the higher education curriculum. Now, let's have an example here. When you are teaching brand new concepts, you may define actions like identify, define, explain, and determine. Now, these objectives are all measuring the cognitive aspect of the learner. Now, affective, on the other hand, tracks the growth in feelings or emotional areas throughout the learning experience. The affective domain are very important to be part and integrated in the lesson, since this hone the motivation, the attitude, perception of learners towards phenomena, and their values. So we better note the importance of the topic to be able to attain this part. And finally, if your lesson involves more advanced sensory tasks, the objectives may include actions like create, use, perform, or measure. Now, these are now our psychomotor domains. Now, if we try to visualize, this involves skills, coordination of the mentality and the body, and the physical movements. Now, let's have examples for topics in the primary level and intermediate level. Now, this first example is from MAPE 1, which is a lesson in music. Now, the first objective is to identify things which have steady and unsteady beats. 2 is to cite the importance of maintaining steady beats in doing activities. 3 is to perform rhythmic patterns with steady and unsteady beats by clapping and tapping. Now, upon reading the learning objectives, what could be the topic that we are teaching here? Right, that is steady beats, which is part of the introduction to the rhythm in grade 1. Now, this lesson is one of the learning competencies in Music 1 based on the Department of Education Music Curriculum. And this uses the CAP format. Now, since the topic is an introduction, we let the pupils identify the things which they perceive to have beats. Now, identifying from their observation and by letting their senses distinguish the steady beats fall under the cognitive domain. Then, for the affective, the importance of maintaining steady beats is being highlighted. This is a good way of integrating the introductory lesson to their life. And for the psychomotor, they will now perform the steady and unsteady beats. So this includes coordination of mental and physical activities. Now, for intermediate grades, let's have Science 5 Sample objective. 1. Describe what distance is. 2. Explain the relevance of distance to motion. 3. Use appropriate tools and standard units in measuring distance. And 4. To convert a metric unit. Now, this is a topic in the intermediate level science which focuses on measuring distance using standard units. Now, there are 4 learning objectives in this lesson, as you can see. And now let's try to figure out our CAP or the CAPs. Now, let's go first with the first one. Describing distance is a cognitive domain since we are identifying all related concepts related to distance in order to describe it. Next is to explain the relevance of distance to motion, and here, the children will determine the significance of the element to the main idea, which is a determining proof whether there is motion or not. So where does this objective belong? Is it cognitive, affective, or psychomotor? Good. It is already in the affective part since the relevance of the subject matter is being identified and explained. The third and the fourth allows the children to coordinate their cognitive into practice. That's why this belongs to psychomotor. Good. Now, after preparing a very tedious lesson objectives, we are now on the second part, which is the details of the subject matter, such as the materials which will be used, the references, your visual aids, your learning concepts, general ideas, and so on and so forth. Now, basically, this is for the information of the lesson. But sometimes your cooperating teachers would want this as the first part of your lesson plan. So better ask your mentor who will guide you on this. The list of materials for each lesson depends on what you plan to teach, how you will teach the lesson, and how you will measure the lesson objectives. And because of this, many teachers compile their list of lesson materials in tandem with their lesson procedure, now which is the third part of the lesson plan. Now, your lesson procedure is an in-depth explanation of how the lesson will progress in the classroom. Now, the lesson procedure is essentially a step-by-step instructions that will walk you through everything. Now, from the time your students enter the classroom until the bell rings at the end of the period, or if the school doesn't have a bell, proper time checking will do. Now, it's smart to be very detailed on this portion of the lesson plan. After all, there will be cases when another teacher or substitute needs to fill in for you or in your absence. Now, it's a win-win situation for both of you. You can make detailed lesson plan, and when you're absent, somebody can fill in your place and teach with most exactly what would you expect to happen. Now, in writing your lesson procedure, you need to choose the type of activities that will help students meet the lesson objectives. Now, to be able to do that, you can outline your procedure and answer a list of questions including 1. How will you introduce the topic? 2. What is the best way to teach this information to your students? 3. How can you incorporate problem solving and critical thinking? Number 4. What real-life scenarios relate to this topic? Number 5. Does this topic lend itself to individual or even group work? Woo! Now, it is also a great idea to observe your cooperating teachers when they teach, so you would get to know the strategies they use in delivering their lessons online and offline. Now, here is an example of an outline of a basic lesson plan. Now, in some institutions, they use the 5 E's, the 7 E's, the 5 P's, the 3 I's, the ELPRR, and many others to outline their procedures. Now, to highlight the event in each part, remember that the first part of your teaching procedure should be more on exploration. In this explore phase, you will introduce the objectives of the lesson and discuss the key concepts which your students should know. but this must come in a very creative process. Now, this portion of your lesson procedure may entail an icebreaker activity to get students thinking about new concepts. But you have to remember that your motivation or your springboard will ignite the curiosity and attention of your learners. That's why you have to integrate relevant things which would really catch their attention. Now, after directing the lesson and presenting it to the class, the next phase is to learn and practice the lesson. It's like allowing them to work independently to get into the details of your lesson. You may either use traditional or non-traditional strategies to discuss your lessons, but again, this would depend on the subject matter. If the learning area requires experimenting, you guide the learners on the things they need to do before, during, and after experimenting. Or if they need to solve, you decode the steps and then let them practice it individually by pair, trio, or by group. Now, the important thing here is to make everything clear for the students. You may draft the possible question which you may throw to the class, so you would be guided by the necessary concepts, or you may forget one not doing so.
Just that.
Another thing is the matter of questioning. In order to create interaction, a good questioning style must be exercised. Oftentimes, I find lower order thinking skill or the LOTS type of questioning to a higher order thinking skill or the HOTS, or sometimes we call it critical questioning, better than presenting the whys and hows at the beginning. For example, you would like to ask about their favorites. Now, let's say your topic is taking care of animals. So you would ask first, do you have a pet? Now this question would be answerable by yes or a no. So this belongs to the lower order questioning skill. So you better add more questions which can give you or lead you to further details about their favorite pet. So you may add, what animal do you have as your pet? And then they might answer, an animal. But you also need to have a plan B question because the answer might be I don't have a pet, right? So in this case, you might ask, but if you will be given a chance to have a pet, what would it be? Now that is a matter of questioning now. Overall, this lesson proper phase will make up the bulk of your question time. So be sure to detail everything out in your lesson procedure. Now the next phase is the generalization, or sometimes they call it the reflection phase. Now this is the part where the students look back and reflect on what they have learned in the lesson. Most often, teachers lead a class discussion with critical thinking questions for learners to answer aloud. So mostly this is for primary graders, or sometimes they let them recite individually. Now these are good for intermediate learners. Sometimes in this phase, we allow them to write on their journal. Now, it is important to list the question you plan to ask within the lesson procedures to make sure you don't forget anything. Now, the next phase is the application to real life, or the reinforcement phase. In this phase, students will apply what they have learned through critical thinking activities. It is like reinforcement of the lesson, but in a fast and creative way. I personally would use this phase to link everything from motivation to discussion and find the connection of the lesson to their real life. This may be a tough part on you, but this portion of the lesson procedure helps you gauge if your students will achieve the lesson objectives and often tie it with the assessment method. Then, the ultimate part of the lesson is the assessment or the evaluation phase. This is now the phase where you measure whether your students learned the lesson information and met your learning objectives. Now, there are dozens of ways on how to measure your students' learning through formative assessments. Some of the common assessment options include quizzes, hands-on activities, writing tasks, group presentations, exit slips, class journal entries, and sometimes teachers let them do differentiated assessment and allow them to present them in front. In addition, your assessment method may be in a class assignment or homework for students to complete prior to the next class. But for demonstration purposes, it would be better to place evaluation phase separate from the assignment or the agreement phase. Now take note, in writing the evaluation phase, always look back on your objective. If your objective is to perform rhythmic patterns with steady and unsteady beats by clapping and tapping, then let them do it by performing. But if it is to use appropriate measuring tools and standard units in measuring distance, and if your objective is also to convert a metric unit, you may either let them demonstrate it or conduct the written test. And before everything else, since you are still at the beginning, never forget the remarks portion on the right side of your lesson plan. So your cooperating teachers would mark your good points and guide you on the things you need to improve more. Now before we end this, always remember that lesson plans are the first steps in creating a full-fledged curriculum for a class. Cooperating and supervising teachers dig the details that ensure you the right information to your students at the right time. And they simplify your career by giving you a roadmap to follow each and every day. If you have further questions and comments, don't forget to use the comment box below and type in your questions. So get your pens now and start writing your journey on becoming a teacher. Bye!